Chapter 2 Lack in the Big Other. Section 3 Che Vuoi. In the section Che Vuoi, Slavoj Žižek undertakes a comprehensive exploration of key Lacanian concepts and their implications for understanding ideology, identity, and the structure of the subject's desire. 1. The ideological quilt and the fixation of signifiers. Žižek starts by introducing the concept of the ideological quilt, point de caption, which plays a pivotal role in establishing and maintaining the coherence of an ideological field. Ideological space is populated by floating signifiers, whose meanings are initially indeterminate. For instance, terms like ecologism, feminism, or democracy lack fixed signification. The point de caption functions as a nodal point that adjusts the sliding of these signifiers and endows them with specific meanings. When communication acts as a point de caption, it retroactively determines the meaning of related signifiers. For example, freedom is redefined as surpassing bourgeois form of freedom, and state is construed as a means of class domination within a communist framework. The ideological struggle essentially revolves around which nodal point will prevail in organizing and defining the meaning of these floating signifiers. 2. Descriptivism versus anti-descriptivism and the nature of naming. The author delves into the philosophical debate between descriptivism and anti-descriptivism. Drawing on Saul Kripke's work, descriptivism posits that a word refers to an object based on its inherent meaning, which is constituted by a cluster of descriptive features. In contrast, anti-descriptivism agrees that a word is linked to an object through an initial primal baptism, and this connection endures even if the descriptive features change. Žižek demonstrates that both positions overlook the radical contingency of naming. Lacanian theory offers a unique perspective by highlighting that the signifier retroactively constructs the identity of the object. For example, in the case of gold, its identity as gold is not solely determined by its physical properties, but is rather established by the signifying train that names it. The Lacanian rigid designator, like the point de caption, targets the impossible real kernel of an object, which represents an excess generated by the signifying operation. 3. Identification and the graph of desire. Žižek proceeds to elucidate Lacan's graph of desire, beginning with the elementary cell of desire. The relationship between the signifier and the signified is characterized by a retroactive production of meaning. The vector of the subjective intention quilts the signifier's train in a backward direction, indicating that meaning is fixed retrospectively. This gives rise to the phenomenon of transference, where the subject erroneously believes that the meaning of a signifier was inherent from the outset, when in fact it was produced retroactively. Identification is further dissected into imaginary and symbolic dimensions. Imaginary identification involves the subject's affinity with an image that enhances self-esteem, while symbolic identification pertains to the position from which the subject is observed. Examples from film and literature are employed to illustrate these concepts. In Chaplin's films, his treatment of children reveals a symbolic identification with the children's gaze. In Dickens' works, the perspective through which the good common people are depicted often emanates from the upper class. 4. The question of Che Vuoi and the function of fantasy. The question Che Vuoi, what do you want, occupies a central position in Lacanian theory. It represents the disparity between the utterance and enunciation, as well as between demand and desire. In the political and social arenas, this question surfaces in various contexts. For example, in anti-Semitism, the actions of Jews are often suspected of being driven by concealed motives. Fantasy serves as a response to this question, filling the void of the big other's desire. However, it also functions as a defense mechanism against the real of the big other's desire. Zizek utilizes examples such as Hitchcock's Rear Window and Vertigo to demonstrate how fantasy structures the subject's desire and how objects enter the fantasy frame. In Rear Window, Grace Kelly becomes an object of desire when she enters the frame of James Stewart's fantasy window. In Vertigo, the transformation of the subject, the portrait, illustrates the disruptive effect when an object too close to the traumatic thing infiltrates the fantasy space. 5. The inconsistent big other and the role of enjoyment in ideology. Zizek further elaborates on the notion that the big other, the symbolic order, is inconsistent and permeable when penetrated by enjoyment. The signifier of the lack in the big other indicates this inherent inconsistency. The Freudian drive is associated with the remnants of enjoyment scattered throughout the symbolic order. The upper level of the graph of desire encompasses the dimension of enjoyment and the pulsation of the drive around the symptom. In the context of ideology, Zizek emphasizes that the last support of the ideological effect lies in the pre-ideological kernel of enjoyment. Taking anti-Semitism as a prime example, he shows that how the figure of the Jew functions not only as symbolically overdetermined entity, but also as an element that enters the framework of fantasy. The Jew is seen as a fetish that both denies and embodies the structural impossibility of a society. The criticism of ideology should involve both discursive analysis, showing how ideological fields are constructed through the montage of floating signifiers, and the extraction of the kernel of enjoyment. The goal is to identify the element within an ideological edifice that represents its own possibility. In the case of anti-Semitism, the Jew is wrongly perceived as the cause of social problems, while in reality, society's own antagonistic nature is the root cause. By going through the social fantasy related to this, one can identify with the symptom and recognize the truth about the social system.